Okay, we're getting close now. It's time to put the sleeves in. So you have your upper sleeve and your undersleeve here. I am actually going to underline this piece, and I thought I would just take a minute to talk about that. Underlining is a term where you take a second layer of fabric, usually in a cotton, and cut the exact same pattern. You baste the pieces together, wrong sides together. So this is my right side, this is my right side, and baste them. No knots, nice and loose. And then I'm going to treat the fabric as one. The reason I'm doing it for this is that the sleeves need more support. This fabric is actually a little lighter than the body of my jacket, which is a contrasting fabric. I chose this because of the texture. I really liked the texture on this. So now I'm just going to have to do a little bit more work. So this is called underlining. This technique is called underlining. Underlining is done a lot with white fabrics. A lot of times if you look at a white garment, sometimes it's lined, but mostly it's almost always underlined, meaning that two fabrics are sewn together to behave as one. So I'm just going to pretend this is one fabric now as I sew it together. So the next thing I need to do is to take my sleeve and measure it. Remove my pieces here. And I'm going to measure my piece, my underarm, and my upper arm. So I have 14 inches. So my pattern is 14 inches. And then what I want to do is to cut a piece of horsehair on the bias. This is nice and stretchy. On the bias, 14 inches long by 5.5 inches high. And that's going to be my support. So that is going to really support the garment from the wrist up into the arm a little bit, but not get into the elbow, where the elbow will end up crushing the horsehair. So we don't want it there. We just want it in right about to mid-arm. So the average is 5.5 inches, and the length will be depending on your pattern. You can measure your pattern, the underarm and the overarm, and of course you cut two, one for each sleeve. Make sure that you mark your hem very clearly with basting so that you can see where the upturn is, particularly because it is on a slight curve. So that's the prep for the sleeve. My next step is going to be to go and to sew just one seam. So I'm going to do the underarm seam first. And then show you how to put the canvas on. Okay, now I have my seam in, and I'm ready to put my interfacing. So what you want to do is to take your bias, cut horsehair, and line it up starting in a corner, because your sleeve is going to take a tiny bit of an arc. So let's start by lining it up with the edge of the fabric. And again, I'm going to leave like a scant 3/8 of an inch on at the edge, because we're gonna fold up like we did the last time. I'm going to keep it the same so that the weight is the same. Okay, and then here, and this is again why we cut on the bias, is now I'm going to stretch this over to fit on this side. So I'm maintaining the integrity of the curve of the sleeve, stretching it at the top a little bit. And pinning it to hold it in shape. Okay, then I'm going to baste it in place. Oh, not before I cut off my extra. So I do have extra here. I'm going to cut off my extra. Make sure you have good light. You can flip this over to do it on the other side just to make sure. So what will happen when we sew is that the canvas will get caught in the seam, and also we're going to tack it in the seam allowance. But first we have to baste it down. So I'm going to take, again, my contrasting thread. So now I know for me, anytime I see a pink thread, it's temporary. Again, you can color code your bastings when you do this for the different levels of definitely coming out, maybe coming out. So I'm going to baste this all the way across. Next step, we're going to attach the horsehair to the jacket through the seam allowance. So I'm going to show you a little stitch that we'll be using in the lining as well. And it's an X stitch. It's not a cross stitch. It's actually an X stitch. And let me zoom in a little closer so you can see. So basically what you're going to do is come through your seam allowance, and then you're going from this seam allowance, you're going to cross over to this seam allowance, and you're going to pick up just the seam allowance on the horsehair in a stitch. And then you're going to come back down to this seam allowance. And again, I'm not catching the sleeve, I'm only catching the seam allowance. And come back out the hole that you started in. And there's your X stitch. I'm going to do it one more time. Come to here, come out at the top, and come in through here, and out through the top again. And again, this stitch we'll be using, I'm going to call this the X stitch, and we'll be using it on our lining. And then I will knot off. So just one thing about knots, anytime I make a knot in sewing, I always bury the tail. So I'll go back in here and come out. Just want to make sure I didn't catch it on the other side. Come out another spot. So I've hidden my tail, and then I can take and cut it through. So then I don't have the tail of the thread hanging around the work. It's hidden inside the work. It'll help with the agitation on the knot too. Okay, so I'm tacked down there. My next step is to go and to sew my back arm seam. With my seam with my seam stitched, I'm going, before I press open, I'm going to score back that horsehair, again in half, both sides. So I'm cutting off half of it. And the next step, after any seam you have in sewing, you're going to do is press. Now, one of the best tools that you can invest in is the sleeve board. So this is a little tiny ironing board that has a couple different widths to it, which is nice, a narrow one and a little thicker one, where you can really press your sleeves. It's called a sleeve board for that reason. So I'm going to take my sleeve and slip it over the arm. There is one of these in the studio. You may, at this point, have to look around for it. but I'm going to slip my sleeve onto the sleeve board now and press my seam open. Again, I'm in an awkward position here, so okay. So slide your sleeve onto the sleeve board and open it. Let my lens clear here for a minute. And you want to do that all the way around. Pull it down as far as you can, and then take it from the other direction. But make sure you give your sleeve a good press. It's going to be impossible to get in there afterwards. If you don't have a sleeve board, you're going to have to do without. But the most important thing is to make sure that you don't press out here. So you really almost have to go with the nose down of the iron and press it. So don't press it flat, because your iron is probably going to be as wide, if not wider, than your sleeve here. Make sure you just get in there and press the sleeve, this sleeve seam. So at this point, just so that you know, in a bespoke tailored jacket, the way that our little men from the first video that we saw constructing, typically at this point, the jacket body would be together, including the lining set in, and the sleeve now would get the lining set in, and then the sleeve would be hand set and the lining would close it up. So typically on a jacket, the lining's already in the body and the sleeves are done separately and then they're attached by hand. But we're doing, as I said earlier today, we're going to depart a little bit and do a little ready-to-wear sewing. So next step is for you. I'm going to zoom in here because this is really important, and it is black, so it's going to be a little hard to see. But you're going to run 2 rows of basting very close to each other. Okay, no knots, no back tack, basting stitch on the machine from mid armhole around to mid armhole. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the top threads of the sleeve and I'm going to very gently pull. Now the reason you always have 2 threads rather, for this process is because it offers stability. When you have one, the body and the seam allowance go all over the place. When you have 2, the seam allowance gets in line and stays where it's supposed to go. So you can see here even maybe the good thing about black is that there's a nice shadow, but see this nice bulge that's happening here? That's really what you want, is that creation of a curve to go over your bicep. So I'm going to pull that just a tiny bit to get it started on both sides. A little sleeve setting refresher, and also this is a 2-piece sleeve, so this is something new for you. So you're going to take your notch in your sleeve. Remember the notch I forgot to have you draft? Now you see how important it is. That notch, you're going to match it up on, so I've got the right side of my sleeve. My sleeve is turned right side out now. My body, for the moment, is turned right side out. I'm going to match my underarms. I actually don't have, you'll be lining up your underarm notch of your sleeve to your seam for most of you, but if you don't have it, I rolled my seam to the back. So if you don't have that, I do have a notch. So now I have a notch on my jacket too, and I'm going to pin it. Then I'm going to take my sleeve, I'm going to take my jacket and turn it inside out. So at this point, I'm going to put my jacket over my sleeve, and I'm going to pin it, the rest of it, in this direction. So I'm going to line up my notches with my shoulder. Again, this is where the notches are really important. So here's my notch. That's going to go line up with my shoulder seam. Once you have those two places lined up, the rest should fall right into place. Then you can see how much gathering you are going to need. Okay? So underarm notch lined up, shoulder lined up. Now the next place I'm going to pin is my notch for my armhole on the side. So again, the other thing too, I have to say, again, more as a reminder than anything, is make sure, like more than 100%, that you're putting the correct sleeve in the correct armhole. So quadruple check that. So now I can see I've given it just a little bit of gathering. I thought I had it a little too much, and I did. So I loosened it up a little bit. I adjusted from here to here because that's where my gathering wants to be. And now also notice I'm pinning on the inside of the sleeve because that's where I want to sew it, is inside the sleeve, because then I can control my gathering. Let's see, lining up here. This is, so I have it that my front lines up. I want it to be exact. So I have my sleeve seam lined up with my front to match exactly. And take this one horizontally. That's looking good. And now I go over and do the same thing in the back. So on the back I know I have 2 notches. So I find the 2 notches on my sleeve and line them up. And then I make my adjustment there. Okay, that. So now I'm going to stop and play with this so that I get all my gathering. Rather, I have to pull a little bit more, it looks like. In the back, I need a little bit more here, which will take up this slack, and then the rest should fall perfectly into line. So I'm going to pin the armhole, underarm, shoulder, front notch, back notch, straighten out my gathering, and make sure the rest is nice and flat. Okay, so I've stitched around my armhole. I go very, very slowly on sleeves because I really hate ripping them out. So I go really, really slowly, but everything was nicely lined up. The one thing I want to say is that you probably will catch your tape in a few spots when you do this. It's not that big of a deal here because it's not really serving the same function as it is down the front of the jacket. So down the front of the jacket is for stabilization, which it is here as well, but it's also to create that little lip so that your front edge looks really nice and sharp, but has a nice roundness to it at the same time. Here, really, this is just stabilizing the armhole. So you don't have to worry if it's not perfectly stitched, you know, if you didn't perfectly stitch it to a canvas to begin with. So it may look a little off, and that'll be fine. Okay, so now the big reveal is to turn it to the outside and see how you did. Remember, again, like we talked about earlier, you're going to push all your seam allowance out. Everything is going to be out away from that shoulder. The shoulder pad will help lift this area, and then we want this nice, you know, ability for it to for the seam allowance to create this little, help with the sleeve head to create a little mound here, but Okay, this is looking good. How's my matchup? Let me check my matchup. Here, oh, right on, love that. Okay, so the next thing then, remembering that you did sew on a curve, just turn this around. We're getting putting the sleeves in is like, you're getting close, you're getting close. I'm not really going to trim, except for some threads, but I am going to clip, okay? If anything is, you know, a little bit heavy here, this is coming out a little far. I might take that off. You see that? And only clip under the arm. Just enough to, again, release the tension of the curve. No trimming, just clipping. And again, as soon as you get up to the spot where you basted, I would stop clipping. So just enough to give that little bit of an underarm. So from not quite mid-armhole around the cap, leave it. Again, if anything's in the way, if anything's sticking out, you know, I've got a lot of threads here. I'm going to go in and clean it up so that it's nice and neat. But I'm only going to clip from like a little beyond mid-armhole around the underarm. Okay? The next step is to put in your shoulder pad. Now, a lot of shoulder pads are actually pretty poorly made now. They really should have this nice curve to them. They should be shaped. I'm actually going to show you a handmade shoulder pad that is made with batting. This is wool batting that's been layered, and also from the side here, if you look at it this way, it's been graded down so it goes from 1 inch, which is pretty healthy, down to nothing, so that it's scored back along the way. But you can make, there are instructions all over the place, including in that wonderful textbook that is online for you for free this year, the one by my teacher, Robert Cabrera, on how to make a shoulder pad. So you can, if you really get into this, this is really where you want to go. But for most of us, short on time, I've purchased a 1/2 inch, which doesn't take much crush for that to get down to less than 1/2 inch. But this is what I'm going to be working with for now. So what you want to do is to find the center of the shoulder pad, and that gets attached. So the shoulder pad will be exactly centered on your center seam, okay? Then it's just a matter of tacking. So you're going to attach it at right here, and again, as I spoke about earlier, you want to make sure that your shoulder pad comes right to the edge of your seam allowance, to your cut edge. Do not put it back where the stitching is. Make sure that it's on the edge here. And you never want to sew the way I've pinned. You never want to sew all the way through. You always want to just tack it down so that you can get the full benefit of its shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tack it, simply tack it by picking up the edge, and I'm going to tack it in 4 spots. I do recommend that you put this on the dress form when you do it, because then you get the nice shape of the shoulder. So slip the jacket inside out onto the dress form, and then put your shoulder pad. Know that if your shoulder pad is shaped, it's going to be counterintuitive to the way it goes. So you're actually putting it in so it curves this way, not this way. because don't forget the jacket's inside out. So your shoulder pad, if it's not the cheap kind like this one, is going to curl up a little bit like this. So then in that case, you would just roll it over to the side and tack it, and then roll it over to this side and tack it. A little tack here. And again, when you tack at the head, you're not going to pin all the way through. That was just to make sure that I knew where it goes. You're going to just attach here with a tack. You're just going to catch the covering to the seam allowance and let the shoulder pad be. Okay. And that's the finished shoulder pad. So I've tacked it here to the shoulder seam. I tacked it to the tape. I thought the tape was a good place. Just a few tacks there, and then I attached it here to the seam allowance. So I did the underside, picked up the underside fabric of the pad and stitched it to the seam allowance of the shoulder. And once it gets pressed, it'll be in place. And it's lined up with the edge, with the cut edge of my garment. And that's your shoulder pad.